A defiant Syrian president vows to retake the whole country as his soldiers make further gains on the ground, backed up by Russian bombing. But is that possible? And could an agreed cessation of hostilities pave the way for renewed talks? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It's been almost 5 years since the start of the Syrian war. The conflict began at the start of what became known as the Arab Spring and has shown no signs of slowing down. The hundreds of thousands dead and millions of displaced refugees have left many global leaders wondering if a peaceful resolution can be found to the conflict after several failed efforts at getting all parties involved in dialogue. But Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has declared that the conflict will not end until all of Syria is back under his control.
We have fully believed in negotiations and in political action since the beginning of this crisis. However, if we negotiate, it does not mean that we stop fighting terrorism. The two tracks are inevitable in Syria. First, through negotiations, and second, through fighting terrorism.
Well, this brings us to Munich, Germany, where a new effort is being seen as a last chance to stop the carnage in Syria. A joint initiative by the United States, Russia and other powers have agreed on a cessation of hostilities, which is due to begin next week. The plan is to allow humanitarian aid to be rushed to besieged areas across the country. However, a strong sense of pessimism hangs over this initiative. To become a reality, the agreement on paper requires the goodwill of all parties, and that seems to be badly lacking. Russia has made no clear commitment to end its airstrikes, and disagreements about President Assad's future continue. Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has even said we may have entered a new Cold War era.
One could go as far as saying we have slid back to a new Cold War. Nearly on an everyday basis, we are being labeled as a terrible threat to NATO or to the United States.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. Joining us in Bahrain, Omar Mohamed, research analyst at the Bahrain Center for Strategic International and Energy Studies. In Oxford, Igor Sutyagin, senior research fellow for Russian studies at the Royal United Services Institute. And in London, Sohrab Ahmari, editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to you all. Let's begin in London with Sohrab Ahmari. The idea of a cessation of hostilities, as it is described, is this wishful thinking by politicians in Munich?
I'm afraid it is. This is another classic instance of the Obama administration believing that signing a piece of paper can triumph over realities on the ground. We've seen that certainly in Ukraine, and we're going to see it again, I believe, in Syria. The agreement on its own face is flawed. It gives the Russians and their client, Mr. Assad, another 7 days to encircle Aleppo to try to strangle the mainstream opposition forces there. And it also identifies groups that are legitimate targets of bombing, Daesh, Islamic State, and Jabhat al-Nusra. That's fine. The only problem is that Mr. Assad and his allies in Moscow and Tehran believe the entire opposition are Daesh terrorists. So, in other words, they can continue making military gains for 7 more days and beyond that. Of course, we know from the experience with the Minsk agreement in Ukraine, where the Russians and their proxies signed the piece of paper twice, and yet they continue to move arms into Ukrainian territory to not cede Ukraine control over its own borders, and so on and so forth. So, all in all, it looks like another Obama administration capitulation, and the signal will be received by both our allies and our adversaries throughout the region.
Well, Igor Sutyagin, allegations there that Russia is buying time in a way, that it is intent on continuing its military operations within Syria. What's your view of that contention?
Well, I would slightly disagree that Russia tries to buy time. No, Russia tries to keep doing as it is And Russia seemingly is not going to abide this agreement anyway, because you can recall that everybody who is being bombed by Russia is being named Daesh. So if tomorrow Russian bombs will fall on the Free Syrian Army, Russian Ministry of Defense will report that they bombed Daesh. So that means that the deal, well, or agreement as it's signed now, means de facto nothing for Russian operations, because there are any limits, any requirements for the Kremlin to stop bombing.
Well, Omar Mohamed, your view, it seems that this agreement, or if one can call it an agreement, does not look very, very optimistic in terms of any form of implementation.
Well, as my two colleagues just pointed out, I mean, they've just clearly stated no one really has hope for this deal to go ahead. Clearly, many of the states involved would like it to go ahead, would like a proper ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities to be carried out. But as we're speaking right now, Russia is still bombing people all around the country, most of whom are not the jihadists who they claim to be bombing. And this is just increasing the refugee problem. In fact, I believe tens of thousands are due to head to Jordan, which, as King Abdullah stated recently, is a tipping point. Many more are going to Turkey, and eventually these pass on to Europe. So this is basically an event that's been held out of an emergency situation due to very dire circumstances. Russia will do all it can, as Sohrab rightly pointed out, to bomb even further, gain further leverage, so that it can have a more say in the talks that do come.
Well, Omar, there has been strong criticism of the United States policies towards Syria. Among those critics, Saudi Arabia, who believe that the US has not fulfilled all its commitments made in that particular region. Your view?
That has definitely been the view amongst many in the region. I think it comes down more to clarity of what to expect, what they're trying to achieve. Saudi has clearly stated, as the foreign ambassador yesterday, I believe, stated that if there is no one else to fill in the vacuum, the people in the region, including Saudi Arabia, are going to have to be forced to take up the role and do it for themselves. The region is burning as we speak. There's, like I mentioned, Jordan, Turkey, all under huge strains due to the refugees. And then there's Yemen, there's the unstable situation in Iraq. So all of this is seen as happening without a real leadership role by anyone in the West, let alone the United States. So that's why you're seeing people standing up, trying to do more.
Sohrab Ahmari, I want to return to the point that you made right at the beginning there, that this is another piece of paper, another example, you are arguing, of failed US diplomacy, which critics argue is an attempt to save face in the face of greater Russian involvement in the region. Would you agree with that?
I do. Setting aside Syria in and of itself, which is just this humanitarian sore on the face of the earth, 250,000 plus dead, millions of refugees, as Omar alluded to, flooding Europe and flooding the rest of the Middle East, which is already unstable, putting pressure on European states. Setting all of that aside, just in terms of pure power dynamics, you want to see a United States that continues to maintain the regional order that in many ways it created after World War II and has maintained through Republican Democratic administrations for some 7 decades. The sense that that order is crumbling and that no other Western power is able or willing to step into the breach, and the only force that is swaggering into the region is Mr. Putin and Moscow. I mean, that's a massive defeat and a really kind of a sad and, from my perspective, infuriating final note on the Obama administration's failed policies in the Middle East.
Well, Igor Sutyagin, is the situation in Syria, which is terrible for the people involved there, but is there a suggestion that Russia is making a play in terms of establishing a greater regional dominance and extending its worldwide influence?
Well, it is not extending, it's trying to restore its worldwide influence. Greater importance in the region, well, it's questionable because losing allies, losing support of Arab nations is not greater influence, it's lesser influence. But Russia plays the wider game, and Syria, like Ukraine, is just part of that. The general idea is to restore the influence, to restore the right of the Kremlin to sit at the high table with the world leaders and to speak on the equal footing with the American president. And so that's what they're doing, and they do not think about the price of that, both for Syrian people and for Russian economy, Russian state. So, yes, they play geopolitical games. They do not pay attention to cost. They do not pay attention to lives, because their interest is, far from human. Their interest is geopolitical. That is what they're doing, and their influence is increasing to some extent, but that is the influence of the major spoiler, not major player or some actor which can propose some positive agenda. No, they are spoiling the situation, but in this word, the most important word which they value is the major. That's what they're doing.
Well, Omar Mohamed, there have been several contacts between Gulf state leaders and Russia in recent weeks, and there will continue to be. Is there concern among Arab leaders about the Russian moves and Russian motives in this particular region? And if so, what could be done about it?
As I mentioned the regional reality earlier, of course there is concern, and the Gulf states, if you look at Bahrain, Saudi, and others, have tried to talk to Russia. They've had plenty of meetings between the defense ministers, heads of state recently. So they have been really trying hard to get Russia to change its position. Russia has effectively, as everyone can see, sort of stemmed the tide away from the rebel forces towards Bashar and Iran in Syria. That is very worrying, which you see now on the ground. Aleppo is completely surrounded, and Bashar's forces are winning. So there is a great concern, yes. The question is, what can the GCC states do about it? Well, for starters, Saudi has recently announced, and the UAE too, I believe, that they will join the coalition on the ground with special forces, perhaps. Jets have already been sent to Turkey, and this is to deal with Daesh, strictly speaking, at least to get rid of that one threat, which is a direct threat to the Gulf states and to other states in the region. So they are trying to step up their involvement in the conflict. Regarding what they can do with Russia, it's a very tricky situation. Russia is no doubt a very important state. They perhaps would like to see more from their Western allies pressuring Putin to stop his bombings, at least follow the guidelines of whatever agreement is made in the peace talks.
Well, Sohrab Ahmari, we heard mention there of the fact that Gulf states joining the coalition in that ongoing operations against ISIL. Yet is this focus on ISIL, which appears to be dominant, certainly among Western leaders, is this something that undercuts the cause of the Syrian people themselves and takes attention and efforts away from resolving this national situation in Syria, rather than focusing on the enemies that the West regards as ISIL?
Well, look, the so-called Islamic State or Daesh is really a grave threat to global security. There's no question about that, and we saw that in the attacks in Paris, the lone wolf attack in San Bernardino, and I think the American people, if you ask them about Syria and about Iraq, they would immediately think of the main threat being ISIS, and perhaps in an immediate sense that's the case. But I think if I can get to the question behind your question, the issue is, why has ISIS been able to be so successful to dominate these vast swaths of territory across the Middle East? And the reason for that is the vacuum that's been created because of a lack of U.S. leadership in the region broadly, and more specifically the fact that in Syria, the only serious force now that stands up to or that a lot of Sunni Arabs believe stands up for them, are jihadists like ISIS and like Jabhat al-Nusra to a lesser extent. And as long as the United States is seen as being all ganged up against the Sunni Arabs with the Russians, with the Iranian regime, with Baghdad and so forth, you will not reverse that sectarian dynamic that feeds into the rise of ISIS. ISIS feeds off of Iran and Assad. They're kind of the same, they're obverse signs of the same coin. And that is the real concern here. Of course, we would want to destroy ISIS, and I think that it's very important that the Arab states, the Sunni Arab states, step up and do that, because as Omar hinted, they are really a major threat to Gulf and Arab security as well. But in order to do that, the Arab states have to feel that the party here that has the most amount of blood on its hand, that is anti-American, anti-Western, and a force for destabilization, which is the Iran-Assad-Hezbollah axis, is also being confronted. And I think that as long as President Obama is in office, that sense of reassurance will not be telegraphed to the Arab states.
Well, Igor Sutyagin, you mentioned a little bit earlier that Russia is saying that virtually every attack it carries out in Syria is aimed at ISIL. How genuine is Russia in terms of focusing its attention on ISIL? Critics contend that it is using this as an excuse in a way to bolster the Assad regime, and most of its operations are actually against anti-Assad movements.
Well, I would say that Russia is not directly interested in bolstering Assad regime. Russia is interested in preserving its own interest in this region. And the interest is to preserve its footprint, its basis in Syria. And if Assad regime is instrumental to secure the Russian presence in this country, then the Kremlin supports Assad regime, not Bashar al-Assad himself. Somebody else can be sitting there if he will promise to secure Russian bases. From this standpoint, the theory is rather simple. Russia is going to make everything to make others to support Assad. And that means that bombing Daesh is actually counterproductive for the Russian policy. What they need is to force the West to lose the alternative option. If the West wants to fight Daesh, and there are currently two options whom to ally, either Assad or opposition, currently the West opts for opposition. If opposition will be destroyed with the joint efforts of Iran, Russia and Assad, then there would be no other option for the West but to ally Assad, and that will mean that the West will support Russian efforts to secure its own bases in Syria. So that is the goal, and that means that fighting Daesh itself is counterproductive. It's the last thing the Kremlin wants to do now, and that is why in different times no less than 70% of strikes at the maximum and up to 95% of Russian strikes were aimed not against Daesh but against other opposition groups fighting Assad regime, because that perfectly serves the goal to help Assad to eliminate the alternative force and to force the West to support Assad and secure Russian interest in Syria in this way.
Omar Mohamed, I want to return to a point that Sohrab Ahmari made a short while ago, and that concerns the issue of sectarian divisions being accentuated by the situation in Syria, and Russian involvement perhaps accentuating these sectarian divisions as well by backing the Shia Alawite government of Bashar al-Assad. Is this a concern, the fact that sectarian fault lines within the societies in the region are being pushed at and probed and perhaps ripped apart by what is happening within Syria?
This is something you could see since 2011. It has gradually increased. But I would say sectarianism has been used as more of a political tool. And of course that affects people on the ground and realities on the ground. This is more of a political battle for regional dominance, which Iran is playing, Russia is trying to play now. But if I could just jump on one of the points Sohrab made before, for the Gulf states. It's, as they've clearly mentioned, their involvement in Syria on the ground would be against Daesh. This is extremely important because, for one, they would be hitting the head of the snake right at the source, which is in Syria. They would try and eliminate it. This would have second and third order effects too, which would hopefully release pressure on the rebels who are being fought now, who are fighting against Daesh, other jihadist groups, the Kurds, Bashar, his militia, Iran, and on top of that, Russian bombing. So this would greatly help the rebels in that sense. And it would deal with a very morbid extremist threat, which is Daesh, once and for all. Another point to be made is, if Daesh is removed, those the rebels on the ground who are losing would have a renewed will to fight further and increase their cause. Because as they're losing now, we're seeing a tendency that the more they're cornered, the more likely they are to join other jihadist groups. This should not be allowed to happen in any circumstance, which is why it's very commendable that the Gulf states will go in and directly tackle groups like Daesh. Now, when it comes to the Russian perspective, as our colleague and Rusi was speaking about, it is counterintuitive and rather counterproductive, because Putin is, in many ways, helping realize his own worst fears, which is the threat of radicalism. He's already dealt with it in Chechnya and other places around. If the rebels do lose, just thinking about the wave of jihadist terror moving around Europe in the region, it's quite frankly speaking quite scary to think of that.
Well, Igor Sutyagin, your view of that Putin is being counter-initiative in a way by supporting the Assad regime. Your view on that?
Yeah, well, I would agree that it is important for Russia to support Assad's regime, but I would add one more thing about the threat of Daesh for Russia. It is important not to overestimate it, because Daesh tries to be really state, unlike Al-Qaeda, and that is why Daesh is interested in concentrating efforts and its supporters on the territory which is currently controlled by Daesh, not sending them abroad. So that means that probably for Russia the threat of Daesh is slightly overestimated. And additional consideration is that, if terrorists will be defeated on ground in Syria and will spread out of Syria, I think that Russia will be the last place where they will go, because it is not very much different from Syria now. It's much more comfortable to fight these bloody imperialists in comfortable Europe than to go to the chilly climate of Russian political pressure. So that is why I think that Putin tries to play this game in two dimensions. The first one is to secure Russian positions there, but the other dimension in parallel is to try to threaten the security of the West, and that will play into his hand to make West more inclined to listen to Putin and make some concessions to Putin, just to stop Putin making harm to the Western security, spreading terrorists to Europe instead of spreading them to Russia. So that is additional consideration. I think it's very important to keep that in mind as well.
Well, a deeply complex situation as the people of Syria continue to suffer. Thanks to our guests, Omar Mohamed, Igor Sutyagin, and Sohrab Ahmari. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for a wider discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.